If economics were a video game, then the way you level up would be by reading more books. In this video, I want to go through some of my favorite books I read in 2022 that are helping me become a better economist for 2023. This first book, I'm going to warn you, is more contagious than COVID. I lent this book to my neighbor, he read it, and then his daughter read it, and then his wife read it. I've recommended this to other people. By far, this is the book that I've recommended the most, and people have actually read it. It covers a lot of really interesting topics that are going on today. It's going to change the perspective on how you see certain things in the labor market. It's going to change how you see how you're developing your own career, or maybe how you're helping your kids develop their career when that time comes. It's been an amazing book, and it is, of course, Career and Family by Claudia Golden. So in my American Economic History class, I have a whole lecture on women in the labor force, and before this book even came out, most of the material I was drawing on for that lecture came from Claudia Golden. Now that she's come out with this book, it's like the authoritative list on what's going on with women in the labor force. This has been a go-to resource. It has great history going through some of the sections of American economic history and how that's affected women in the labor force. And it also has a really important theory explaining the gender gap in wages. Now, this is the only book out of all the ones that I have so far that I've actually done a whole separate video on that, so I'll refer you to that at the end of this video. Actually, I think this next one is one where I think I would like to do a deeper dive into this book because I relate to it. I can see my ancestors as they came to America were reflecting the principles that were in this book. And that's kind of the giveaway right there, talking about my ancestors coming to America, because this next book is Streets of Gold by Ron Abramitski and Leah Boustan. The subtitle of this book is America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. And yeah, it goes through and gives a fantastic view on immigration. And the benefit of this book, it's a pretty thin book. You can get through it very quickly, and they've done some amazing work bringing together huge data sets from organizations like Family Search, Ancestry.com, and they're saying, let's take actual data on immigration, on families, and seeing how people progress over time, how these families evolve once they come to the United States. And it's inspiring, it is fascinating, and again, this is one that comes in when I talk about immigration in my American Economic History class. I'm citing their work. Before this book even came out, I was citing their work because they've done some of the best stuff on American immigration. But also, some of the findings in here I'm realizing are so interesting to tell my students, and they can take lessons from that and apply it to their own lives and say, well, what was it that made immigrants succeed? And now that I'm going out into the world, what can I do to make sure I succeed? This next book is going to make you smarter than an international best-selling author of more than 65 novels. So if I were asked to describe the international perspective of 2022 in one word, I think that one word would be conflict. Now, obviously, at the beginning of the year, the Russian aggression against Ukraine started, and so that is a big source of conflict. That's something that we're thinking about a lot. But I've mentioned many times before, and I'll mention more today, I do a lot of research on Haiti, and right now Haiti is experiencing severe conflict. Gangs are taking over the country. It's just a mess, and seeing all of this conflict around the world might make you wonder, why does this go on? Why do we fight? And that book helps answer that question because, surprise, the book is called Why We Fight by Chris Blotman. Chris Blotman is one of my favorite economists because he has such a good grasp on not just the quantitative side of going in and like, how are we going to measure this and do a good job on the econometrics. He also comes through on the qualitative side. Like, he tells some of the stories behind his research in here, how he's going out and talking to, insurgent leaders, gangs, just going in and doing crazy intense stuff. I am just blown away by what he does. All of these books so far have been very accessible, no matter what your level of training in economics is. I think what I like about this book is that it has kind of a gauge that you can turn yourself to determine how much economics you want to learn from it. If you have zero understanding of economics, you're still going to be able to understand what's going on in this book because it's presented in a very accessible way. But if you are at an intermediate or even an advanced level of economics, you'll recognize the game theory that's going on in this book, and you can pick up the deeper models that are in this book if you want to. Now, what about that promise about this book making you smarter than an international best-selling author? Well, just last week, Stephen King sent out this tweet. If a woman was in charge of Russia instead of the testosterone-fueled current leader, the war in Ukraine could be over by New Year's Day, and we could all breathe a little easier.
Oh no!
When I read that tweet, I just immediately thought of this book because he dedicated like half a chapter to discussing this question on whether putting women in leadership roles leads to less conflict. This is another book where I think I'd like to do a deeper dive about the content in there. If you're interested in that, just go down, there's a subscribe button, and right underneath it, there's a comment area. Just go ahead and tell me what you're interested in. Speaking of Chris Blotman, somewhere either on his Twitter or his blog, I got the recommendation for this next book, but let me frame why I wanted to read this next book. I get a little bit too focused on really narrow topics. That's kind of the curse of an academic. This year I worked on a couple of papers about Haiti and how it was developing state capacity, how the rule of law comes to play in Haiti, but there are some bigger questions about how the rule of law became even a concept that we care about. And so I was looking for some books that were going to help me get a little bit more at this higher level picture of the topics that I'm interested in. And that's what this next book does. Like, it goes in and says, where does the rule of law come from? How did we decide that there should be a law that binds people and that it's not just the will of the ruler who decides what's going on? Or how do we get to these bigger picture questions of political order and existing in states? So this book is The Origins of Political Order by Francis Fukuyama. It is a thick double C book, and really it's only part 1. I have part 2 back here, but I haven't actually gotten into it yet. But it's super interesting where it's really trying to do big, long history. Pre-human, that's how far back this is trying to go, to the French Revolution. I have not read all of it, but the parts that I have read got me thinking, and they're the kind of things where I bring them up to friends and say like, hey, about the rule of law, this is the theory, like, what's your view on that? And that's what made this a really interesting book for me, and why I wanted to recommend it, and why it made me a better economist. I consider both of those previous 2 books just at that intersection of history and economic development. This next book is very much a development economics book. And let me just preface it by asking you, what if you could be mentored by the chief economist of one of the largest aid organizations in the world? That would be an amazing opportunity to think about how economists at these top organizations are thinking about development policy. What are they finding works? What doesn't work? And this next book is written by that very economist. It is a fantastic mix of theory and big ideas like I was just talking about, but also practical policy. Like, what can we do to help encourage development in these poor countries? So this book that I keep mentioning is Gambling on Development by Stephen Durkin. He is the former chief economist of the UK's International Development, I don't know what it is, it's right here. I can't remember the name of the organization, but this guy has worked with millions, if not billions of dollars. He says at the beginning how much they're actually dispersing. What I love about this book is that question that I posed to you at the beginning, what if you could be mentored by a top economist? Well, he tells the story of one of the leaders of the development agency who didn't understand much about development economics or development policy. And so he walks through his process of mentoring this top UK official. And so you get the benefits of that as you're reading through this book. And then, like I said, the case study is super interesting where he's going through mostly African countries and walking through like, here's where they did well, here's where they failed, and this is what we can learn. Like, I have not fully digested all the lessons from this. I feel bad. I want to just like get into those case studies and I haven't had enough time to do that. So I'm still going to be reading this. Again, I keep bringing this up. I think this is another book that would be worthy of a deeper dive. And from what I can tell on Twitter, Stefan Durkin might be really interested in coming on here. So let me know if you want to hear more about development economics. I have one more book that I would say has radically changed how I see the world. But before I get there, I always like to include some fiction in these because I think it's important not just to be reading nonfiction. And I think what's really fun is books that do a really good job at incorporating economics into them. Some examples that you're probably familiar with are, look at Infinity War. Thanos is talking about a Malthusian model of economic growth. Like, his economics are influencing his villainy. Another great one is Batman, The Dark Knight. So Joker is constantly doing game theoretic games with them, trying to throw them off. It makes it really interesting to see that come in and influence the storyline. So when you have good economics in a story, it creates really entertaining narratives. And so I have this year enjoyed rereading the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. I don't actually have any in hard copy because I read them all on my Kindle, but there you go, it's right there. I said rereading. I've read the first 6 books, and then this year the 7th book came out, and so I was rereading those to be prepared for that 7th book. What's really fun is going through this and seeing how seriously he takes the economics. Like, the first set of 3 books, economics is playing a huge role in the motives behind the characters. The second set of 3 books, well, I guess 4 books now, there are economics in there about, it's a fantasy world, so how has the fantasy and the magic affected the economics of the world? I just love how economics is taken seriously in these books, and it makes it just so much more entertaining for that reason. Okay, the final book in my recommendations, like I said, is one that has changed my perception of the world. And what I mean by that is, as an economist, I understand that people have preferences and they have constraints. And I look a lot at, like, where do these constraints come from? Are they institutions? Are they resource constraints? There's lots of ways that constraints come in. But preferences, I kind of just take as given. I haven't really gone into understanding preferences. And this book is mostly about trying to understand what drives people's preferences. It is a fantastically written book. It's a very compelling read, and it's not surprising. I recommended this author last year for another book on how to tell stories. The book is The Status Game by Will Storr. When I say it's changed the way I see in the world, I mean he's talking about preferences come from our search for status. And I see that in myself, and now I'm seeing it in others, and it just makes a lot more sense. It really has changed the way I see the world. And if you are interested in changing the way you see the world, then you should check out this playlist of books that I've recommended in the past, because I guarantee you're gonna find things that change the way you see the world.